All right, welcome everyone to part 5 of our Survivor Advisory Board Summer, our learning series. We are almost done with wrapping this up, which means it's fall and spooky season around the corner. Um, but for now, settle in. We are letting people in from the waiting room. So thank you guys so much for accommodating the time change at the last minute. Sometimes things just happen and you got to be where you got to be. And all of us that have ever done victim services know our schedules sometimes are just not our own, even the best laid plans sometimes. So. All right, we'll give people just a few minutes to get started. Um, I am super excited about this session today. Okay. Keeping an eye out for a few folks that I know told me they were going to be here today, and they're usually my check-ins. So. All right, so good morning again. For those of y'all that haven't met me, I'm Crystal Garcia. I'm the content coordinator here at TASA, and I coordinate all of our webinars and online learning opportunities. So if you want to take a second and double check your chat box and make sure that you can use the features on there. Everybody has the settings set up to be able to send messages to the entire group chat, but you do need to make sure that blue button at the bottom says that you are sending your message to everyone. So to double check that, if you want to pop in, say hi, let us know where you are logging in from today. Um, Oh, I see somebody from Voice of Hope in Lubbock. I wanted to give them a shout out. They are celebrating their 50th anniversary of providing victim services. I went to school at Tech. I learned my very first stuff about victim services from the then Lubbock Rape Crisis Center, which is now Voice of Hope. So, y'all congratulate them on such a milestone to be operating for 50 years of victim services in West Texas. That is amazing. So I think they are having a little gala or party. I saw a thing about their sponsors yesterday. So. Right. Oh, look at that. This Rape Crisis Center in San Antonio is also celebrating their 50th anniversary this year. That is amazing. So. All right, y'all, let's get going. I'm thinking more people will kind of hop in just because we did have a time switch. So a few people let me know they might be late and stuff like that. But I'm going to go ahead and turn everything over to Samantha. For those of y'all that are needing continuing education credits, we are working on those certificates. We are going to send those out together. If you are in need of something, I know some people are due at the end of the month for licensing renewal. So I just wanted to give y'all a reminder. If you are in that group that needs to renew in September and you have attended one of the webinars in August or September and you are in need of proof of that and a CEU certificate, please just send me an email. I'll put my email address in the chat box so we can get you those because I know that deadline and quite a few providers renew in September. So we want to make sure to get you all your paperwork and get you credit for being at any of our webinars that we have offered throughout the year. So with that said, I will go ahead and turn this over to Samantha.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha McCoy. I am an attorney here in Austin, Texas. Prior to law school, I did obtain my LMSW, and since then have really focused on what I can do to incorporate trauma-informed responses into my legal advocacy and my work. Um, I was interested in this topic, the overlooked link between climate disasters and sexual violence, when I started hearing a lot of the legal community talking um, about an issue that's somewhat related, insurance claims. And what we were seeing in the insurance claim realm was that there were so many insurance claims that were being made for property damage that the insurance companies were having to get something called reinsurance, which is basically insurance for insurance. It's also why you might see deductibles going up, is because of the demand of all of these insurance claims being sent in. Um, and through that, realizing that there is a link between climate disasters and sexual violence. So hopefully today you can walk away with some concrete examples of things that you and or your organization can do to really protect your community, because this is not something that is going to be going away anytime soon. In fact, it's going to be continuously getting worse. And so, to just briefly frame the issues, I don't think anybody necessarily denies climate change at this point in time, but I did find some startling statistics that I think really highlight the issue and how severe the issue actually is. In 2024, it was the warmest year on record. I have the 17.16 degrees Celsius as the temperature. What that is about 64 degrees Fahrenheit, but it is the highest ever recorded as a global daily average in temperature. In addition, global mean sea levels have continuously rose. It's actually hit a record high for the 13th consecutive year. Um, Unfortunately, that also means that glaciers around the world are continuing to melt. For example, in South America, Venezuela became the first Andes country to register the loss of all of their glaciers. And 58 global reference glaciers across 5 continents lost mass in 2024. For carbon monoxide growth, from 2023 to 2024, it tied for the highest increase ever recorded. And so when we think about these continuous climate changes with desert expansion, environmental degradation, unfortunately, it's currently displaced more than 20 million people each year, forcing them to migrate to other regions or countries. That's according to the United Nations High Commissioners for Refugees. Research also anticipates that many of the low-lying Pacific islands, such as the Marshall Islands, will become uninhabitable by 2050, which is not that far off. And that's because of the direct and indirect consequences of these wave-driven flooding. Uh, Also looking into a lot of what the United Nations has for their resources. They are continuously raising flags of being concerned about the increase of the risk of epidemic potentials of infectious diseases, as well as additional human-caused disasters. You think of political instability, armed conflict, and terrorism, all things in which I think we've all seen within the media in the last several years, and further exacerbate and continue to impact climate change specifically. And so if you are a visual learner like I am, I wanted to include these graphs so that you can see really the impact that it's had. So this is the global mean temperature. At the beginning of the graph is about 1850. And then if you look at where the graph is now in 2025 being the highest, or 2024, I apologize. And this is also something, another visual graph that describes climate anomalies. And this is just within 2024, the things that really were atypical and concerning to experts and climate scientists specifically. Um, so, for example, the South American drought, severe drought conditions affected large parts of South America as record heats unfortunately impacted the entire continent. In South America, it was also the warmest year on record, for example. And because those statistics that I just gave were for 2024, I did want to just briefly highlight some of the impacts that we've seen just in 2025 this year. So we all remember in January that the wildfires in Southern California destroyed over 18,000 structures, burned 50,000 acres, and killed 30 people. In March of this year, there was also the southern Mississippi tornadoes. This is where two tornadoes struck within 41 minutes, causing severe damage and displacing hundreds. Um, in July, there was the record-breaking megastorm series in the Midwest, um, which was supercell storms that hit Iowa and Missouri. And over 156 tornadoes were confirmed in just one week within those towns, causing flash floods and other disasters. In May, they had the Mid-Atlantic floods. So that was flash floods that devastated parts of Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia. And unfortunately, there were multiple fatalities within that, as well as the widespread property damage that you can imagine. In Alaska in June, they had over 150 wildfires burn 56,000 acres. It was the earliest and most intense fire season in Alaska's history. And then, unfortunately, as we all remember, in July, the Central Texas floods that resulted in over 135 deaths. Infrastructure was also overwhelmed, and the emergency shelters were inundated due to the severity of those floods in Kirk County. And the graph that I have behind here, or the visual that I have behind here, is actually a photo from one of the fires in the California area. And some people also relate more to cost and what damages are actually being done. And unfortunately, natural disasters in the US caused over 131 billion in damages in the first half of 2025 alone. Wildfires alone counted for 68.4 billion over the past 5 years, with earthquakes being 14.7 billion annually. And what this really means for people and what it's doing to our communities is that more than 50,000 people were displaced by climate-related disasters in 2025, which is a new global high that people have not seen before. So what we know about the link between climate disasters and sexual violence, disasters often reveal and they do reinforce these social, political, and economic inequities that already exist in the United States and around the globe. These immediate and long-term effects of disasters increase the overall prevalence of sexual harassment, abuse, and assault. It also worsens the frequency, severity of harm for victims that are experiencing ongoing sexual violence. So you might see this in a lot of cases of domestic violence situations where, for example, in Winter Storm Uri, where it hit Texas for the freeze that unfortunately took lives a few years back, the amount of domestic violence reports that were coming out of Winter Storm Uri just kind of really highlighted this issue of these disasters not only exacerbating sexual violence to those that may be in stranger or acquaintance situations, but it also, if there's someone who's been experiencing ongoing sexual violence or domestic violence, this does exacerbate it and further continue to cause barriers for survivors to be able to heal. And I did want to just mention that although the effects of disasters are widespread, the hardship is not distributed equally. And what I mean by this is really thinking about our Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, where there's already a inequality and disproportionate resource allocation. So people experiencing economic and housing insecurity, those documented and undocumented immigrants, people with disabilities, children, elderly, LGBTQ people, trans, all of those who kind of live at these intersections and are otherwise historically marginalized identities are further impacted by these disasters. And I will go into that a little bit more in detail throughout the slide. And so I wanted to just highlight two examples. I wanted to give a global example as well as a US based example. And the reason being is that I want to highlight that there are commonalities between what we're seeing on the global scale as well as what we're seeing in the United States. And what this really speaks to is that it is a global issue and it is something that is going to continuously come up regardless of someone's geographic location. So in the Philippines, unfortunately, they had a super typhoon. Locally, they called it Yolanda, but the international name is Haiyan. If you happen to look it up, that's why there's two different names. It did hit the Philippines in November of 2013. It displaced more than 4.1 million people. It negatively affected more than 12 million and killed 6,300 people. And I chose the median statistics that were available. There were numbers that do reflect a little bit lower and numbers that reflect a little bit higher. And so to be a little bit more accurate, I stayed within the numbers that were the median range. At the time that this typhoon struck, the country was already recovering from other recent emergencies and something that we will continue to see as these climate disasters occur. They had an earthquake just a month before, and there was also escalating conflict that had happened a few months before in a neighboring area. Nearly one quarter of people reported experiencing interpersonal violence immediately after the typhoon. Cases of rape, human trafficking, and commercial sexual exploitation of children were also reported. Unfortunately, the exact numbers of this are very hard to ascertain. When doing more research, the main theme that continuously came up is that, especially in the Philippines and what we see in other cultures, is that there is this pervasiveness of underreporting. And specifically in the Philippines, that is something that is of grave concern. And so the exact numbers are very hard to discern. In addition, there has been an admitted failure to really ascertain the data in general. Um, Regional police admitted that they do not compile trafficking statistics generally. And then after receiving some statistics, um, a national police spokesperson refused to comment as to why they did not or could not provide figures from that same period of before the typhoon or in more recent years. So it really puts into perspective that the lack of data makes it very hard to really grasp these issues and makes it go undetected at a further rate. So what occurred in the Philippines is that many of those who survived the typhoon were forced into shelters. These shelters, as you will hear throughout this presentation, are very, very dangerous situations. As you can imagine, these shelters are put together at last minute, and oftentimes as there's not a lot of time to really prepare for safety protocols and other things that should be considered into these emergency evacuation shelters. Rape was particularly high in these shelters, as well as other forms of sexual abuse and violence. The children and women were cramped in these temporary and permanent shelters. Um, there were two stories that I was able to kind of pull together, though the names were not given of the people. One woman was 28. She reported that she was trafficked after the typhoon from her village and taken where she was forced into the sex trade. She did escape from a den that she was being held in and went back to the city where she was from, but she was afraid to file a police report. And so, although she was willing to anonymously share her story with a reporter, she was unwilling to really document and pursue any charges for what she experienced. And that is, again, very common, especially within the Philippines. Another 21-year-old reported that she was raped a month after the typhoon struck, where a masked man had attacked her with a knife. and had dragged her onto a street during the sexual assault. And unfortunately, there are plenty of stories out there within the Philippines, within Haiti, where this is happening at increased and concerning levels. So, besides making more women and girls vulnerable to sexual violence, the typhoon also wreaked havoc on law enforcement efforts. So, one journalist was able to discuss and talk to a social worker who was in the Philippines and had clients that she was working with within the domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking area. And she reported that a lot of what they had was paper documentation. And when that typhoon struck, their court documents were washed away. So, due to the loss of paperwork and court delays, one of her cases that she had been working on, it took 13 years to secure a conviction because of that loss. And the same is true for law enforcement efforts and the infrastructure degradation that happens during these climate disasters. According to the UN, there were 670 reported cases of trafficking, specifically in these regions affected by Typhoon Haiyan, and that's between 2013 and 2015. So within 2 years of that typhoon striking, there were 670 reported cases. Again, keeping in mind that this is not reflective of those that were not reported ultimately. And although there were foreign aid groups that gave money to shelters and others, certainly was not enough. And unfortunately, that funding often times after a disaster specifically runs out very quickly. Um, in addition, the lack of funding has also hit efforts to catch traffickers. So, when asked, a civil society group that actually helps police monitor these trafficking cases within these poor villages in the Philippines, said, quote, "As much as we want to solve trafficking, we lack the budget, training, and support to sustain the efforts." And this was in response to not only this typhoon, but the two previous disasters that they had, the earthquake and then the conflict that they were experiencing in other areas. And with all of those things combined, really impacting any efforts to actually not only have prevention efforts, but also address those um, efforts after the crime has already been committed. And so moving into a US example, I think we all can remember Hurricane Katrina. Um, in 2005, there were reports of sexual assault within the Superdome shelter and other evacuation locations, and this was within hours of these people evacuating. Um, Almost a third of those reported incidents did occur at these evacuation shelters and with an increased number to Black women. And I've said that I would highlight the fact that these evacuation shelters do tend to be a very dangerous area. The same is true in addition to the Philippines and in addition to Haiti. And I wanted to list those statistics as well. So, girls and young women aged 13 to 24 that were living in those emergency camps in Haiti after their 2010 earthquake were significantly more likely to experience sexual abuse. And that's according to the CDC. But within Katrina, at least 42 cases of rape within 6 months after the disaster were reported. And again, we need to ensure that we take in mind that some cases were not reported and there is underreporting in general for sexual violence cases. I think it's 33.3% of all sexual violence cases not in a disaster time are not reported. And then 156 additional reports were also made to an outside agency. There were reports of breakdowns in law enforcement that really expanded this crisis situation and made it far more dangerous. Um, this was a very interesting point that I really wanted to highlight that I found within a Washington Post article. Um, since Hurricane Katrina, recovery in the predominantly white neighborhoods far outpaced the recovery in the predominantly Black neighborhoods, obviously due to the systemic racial disparities in federal aid. But as a result, nearly 100,000 fewer Black people live in New Orleans a decade after the storm than before it. And that just really speaks to um, the fact that the hardships are not equally experienced within these climate disasters. And so I found some excerpts from a wonderful resource from the NSVRC that really described the conditions that were being experienced at Katrina. There were temperatures well over 100 degrees. There was no air conditioning or adequate ventilation within the Superdome. Um, Parents and caretakers also had to try to constrain thousands of children who obviously were being restless and trying to explore the Superdome, sometimes without supervision and in low visibility conditions. There was virtually no water pressure. The bathrooms were insufficient for the number of people using them. And so it created this situation where the floors actually became slick with human feces, sweat, humidity, um, and nearly 30,000 people were in these conditions within the Superdome specifically. And as you can imagine, the conditions that worsen also safety declines. And so these massive crowds became more agitated, angrier. Women, children, and people with disabilities were at a very heightened risk of being abused and attacked. Um, those who did not make it to one of the larger shelters, like the Superdome, were tried to find refuge wherever they could. And this could mean just random hallways that they found, buildings that they were able to access and get to, um, which is also a very unsafe situation. So, with law enforcement occupying these emergency duties, there was no protection available for those who were stranded or helpless in different locations within the city. Um, and one victim of sexual assault reported, a 46-year-old woman reported that she was raped on the first day of the storm after she sought refuge in one of the block apartments that was meant for the elderly. But she had to sleep in the hallway. And as she was sleeping in the hallway, there was a man who attacked her and sexually assaulted her with a gun. And this was the case for several other women at the same location who unfortunately were just trying to get refuge within the hallways or within the building in general. Um, she reported that the police were not as responsive. She said that the law enforcement agencies treated it as though they did not want to hear it. And will dive into law enforcement responses a little bit later. But as you can imagine, there's also the chaos of trying to deal with the um, natural disasters and also trying to save lives. Um, she did seek medical care when she was later evacuated to Baton Rouge. Another victim was sexually assaulted after she was beaten with a bat, and this was in broad daylight on a street corner, and this was a week after the hurricane struck. She said she reported to police, but her assailant was never caught. Um, Really illustrating the need for these widespread prevention efforts and not just designated shelters without more planning within these shelters. There's nothing inherently wrong with the shelters, but there needs to be safety precautions. And we will address that a little bit later in the presentation. Another thing that I came across within my research that was very startling was inmate sexual violence increasing. So, prisoners are, as you can imagine, often excluded from these disaster planning conditions. Um, a lack of preparedness um, in these extremely dangerous conditions exacerbate issues. So, this was the same within Katrina, Rita, Ike, Harvey, Irma, and Maria. But specifically for Katrina, corrections officers were reportedly failed to evacuate facilities in the storm path. So inmates were left in these flooded, overcrowded cells. There was no power, food, water, or medical care, and no access was permitted from the outside to be able to assist and help. In first-person accounts, there are inmates that reported that as nonviolent inmates, they were beaten, robbed, and sexually assaulted by violent offenders. Staff were accused of being indifferent. They were asked why they admitted to witnessing the abuse but did not stop it. And some staff reported that the conditions were just too uncontrollable. Um, the inmates' recollection is that they were just indifferent to the situation. Obviously, it's a matter of perspective and taking into consideration all of the moving parts. And so when a Harvard research study was conducted on these, her after the Hurricane Katrina hit, the survivors were asked to state their four most troubling hurricane-related problems. Um, they reported financial, housing, attaining services, and employment as the top four areas. And so when you look at multiple fields of study, whether that's criminology, sociology, psychology, all of these issues, financial problems, housing problems, attaining services, employment, those are all leading factors in the perpetration and reoffense of harmful and criminal behaviors. It also tells research also tells us that the personal stressors, um, these serve as a definitive risk factor for reoffensive sexual violence. And I wanted to highlight specifically too, because I think it's very important to consider, children are impacted by sexual violence and disasters at high rates. When we think of child sexual abuse, according to the CDC, just in general, not within disasters specifically, but 90% of children um, who are sexually abused, it's committed by someone that's known to the child. So when you think of situations when climate disasters hit, such as the winter storm Uri and others that might require a shelter in place, it actually traps these children with abusers um, at a higher um, rate than they might not normally be. Maybe they would be able to go to school, get some relief, go down the block. Those things are not necessarily available in these crisis situations, especially when shelter in places are ordered. Displacement, additionally, even if there's not a shelter in place, it leaves children unattended and separated from their caregivers. So you think of the situation within Katrina and the Superdome, the children are getting restless. So the parents are like, okay, you can go explore with these kids. But unfortunately, abusers exploit those unstable conditions and that lack of supervision to be able to perpetrate abuse against children. It also further reduces children's access to trusted adults and other mandated reporters. So obviously, while a crisis situation is going on, it's they're not going to be exposed to teachers or people at their church or someone else who could see that there might be abuse going on and report it. And that's also why in research we see that disclosures increase after the disaster, only when the child is able to return to a stable environment. And that is because that abuse is able to be detected and not in this isolation setting. And so, looking at risk factors for violence during these um, disaster situations, the CDC outlines these potential risk factors. I do want to notate that just because these risk factors exist does not mean someone is going to perpetuate sexual violence. It's very important um, to mention. People can experience any and all of these things and not perpetuate. But if there's already a propensity, the CDC has identified these as concerning situations that might cause somebody who has offended to reoffend. We know that disasters have led to spikes in gun purchases. This becomes very concerning in the sense of domestic violence situations, but also when you think of um, having somebody that isn't getting mental health treatment, having access to these gun purchases and being able to go into these very unstable communities to impact and cause further harm. Disasters also frequently, obviously, cause trauma and stress. It can lead to increased drug or alcohol use. And when you think about those with underlying mental health conditions, oftentimes those treatment facilities and those that kind of hold them accountable are impacted, whether that's shutting down, um, not being as open as they would be, so limited hours of functioning. And so all of those factors, according to the World Health Organization, so you think of limited coping skills, drug and alcohol use, unmet mental health needs, those all may increase a person's likelihood to commit sexual violence. In addition, there's weakened institutional support. So as I've mentioned before, when the police and judicial systems are not really understanding and having the proper response to survivors during and after these disasters, it leads the perpetuation of abuse to continue. And so, for example, law enforcement might be overwhelmed or unable to respond to sexual violence reports, or when they do respond, they cannot, whether that's emotionally and personally, or just time wise cannot just give it the proper attention that it deserves. It often sexual offenses are deprioritized compared to other crimes within these disaster responses, so they can be treated as not as emergent. There are disruptions that also occur in the accountability systems. And so not only are you not getting the mental health treatment that you might need, but if you also think of other accountability systems such as probation, parole, drug testing, other mental health services, those all tend to be impacted during these disaster. Um, and what that leads to is an increase of potential reoffense. And at least one study did show that the release of incarcerated individuals during a disaster can increase the community risk if it's not done with proper safety guards. And not surprisingly, as you can imagine, there are weak laws and policies, um, really, if any, that relate to sexual violence, especially in these disaster situations, to really combat and hold people accountable for any behaviors that they might be doing during these climate disasters. So while the disaster planning and response on the local, state, and federal levels continue to fall short, this increases the perpetuation and it also further increases the barriers for survivors to healing. As you can imagine as well, the economic insecurity, um, disrupted support systems, there's limited access to resource during these climate disasters. Oftentimes, these disasters do cause massive financial loss, even if they might have insurance or something. Those claims take a while to be processed, investigated, and officially paid out. So you're looking at people who are experiencing the loss of a job, a home, all of their possessions. Um, and for marginalized communities specifically, those inequities of employment, housing, and public assistance worsen after disaster at higher rates. And indeed, we know that housing security alone is known to increase sexual violence. If you look at statistics for just the homeless populations, we see that there is a very high rate of women specifically who are homeless, who are experiencing sexual violence every day. And so when these housing insecurities happen to a mass population, those that increased number is going to continue to skyrocket. Um, when someone's home is destroyed, there's often within the community rental prices spiking due to the reduced housing supply and the increase of demand. Affordable housing has also in the past been decided to be demolished instead of rebuilt after these disasters. And this makes it very difficult, especially when you think about emergency shelters. Once they reach capacity, it is very hard for there to be any other option, especially in these situations. And so that leads to people such as the woman in Hurricane Katrina that was attacked to be sleeping in hallways of any building that they are possibly able to access or find. And then, of course, you think of social isolation, just in general. We know that within domestic violence and sexual violence situations, social isolation is considered a tool that abusers can use to have that power and control over a victim. And this is exacerbated in these climate disasters because you think of having to relocate, not knowing people who might be in the community. Evacuees are often losing access to community networks and support systems. So, for example, there are school closures, churches, cultural centers that someone might have been able to get some level of refuge or to confide in for support being closed or destroyed during this time. Um, and the abuse becomes harder to detect because of that social isolation. So, children, older adults, and people with disabilities are significantly impacted by this social isolation piece. And just as a final point to this displacement issue, because I think it is so important to discuss why these shelters often um, lack in the safety planning that is needed. And this will be very helpful to describe later within this presentation of the things that the shelters can do or things that you can ensure if you're referring a client to that the shelters actually have these available so they are not being put in a dangerous situation if at all possible. So what we know from all of the global research on these um, camps and or shelters, it depends on just what they call it. There's not necessarily a difference between that terminology, but it is difficult for shelter workers and law enforcement to identify or track people who are on the sex offender registry. As you can imagine, the idea is that everybody needs a safe place. And so this inability to track and identify those registered sex offenders while also housing them potentially next to children um, can be a very dangerous situation and or disabilities. Also, evacuation shelters commonly have been reported to not have like locking doors on bathroom facilities or private areas for sleeping. So, co-sleeping very close to one another, not being able to have any privacy within using the bathroom or getting changed, um, adequate lighting, particularly in more remote or secluded places, all can contribute to this increased risk of sexual violence. Um, and that was noted by the United Nations specifically during their research. Um, and when you think about the presence or absence of gender segregated facilities, because there are individuals who are on board with segregating those facilities by gender. Um, but when you think of the potential consider a risk of harm for transgender or non-binary folks, this can be a very dangerous situation. Um, and so it's just something to keep in mind that although you might have benefits for one, it's not necessarily all inclusive for everyone. And of course, the lack of privacy in these shelters for displaced persons make it very difficult for a survivor to disclose any violence that they might be seeing or experiencing. And the services within those shelters are often very overwhelmed. And I do want to mention that there are gaps within the data collection for a myriad of reasons. Um, Obviously, as I've talked on before, the underreporting for cultural reasons, lack of trust in law enforcement in general, etc., that exacerbates the issue to be able to obtain the exact scope of what these issues are. In addition, there is a lack of standardization in these disaster settings. Um, in the ability to obtain this data. And so there is inconsistent reporting across different disasters. And this really makes it challenging on the international level to do a true comparison because there is no standard protocol for the data to be collected. Some prolonged disasters, such as droughts, have not been further researched thoroughly. And so the correlation between certain disasters and sexual violence are really not studied and haven't been studied. Um, there's also a low priority in the aftermath of disaster to collect data because these basic needs are taking precedence. And so it leads to this gap where it might not necessarily being it might not necessarily be collected within that moment. You're also having to consider that this data collection is happening in these very disrupted areas. So there's a breakdown in social structures, inadequate protection measures. The data becomes very unreliable because of these conditions. And then unfortunately, because of the lack of awareness and prioritization of this link between sexual violence and natural disasters, there hasn't been many people that are um, interested in addressing these gaps and fixing, for example, the lack of standardization in collection of data. And so lastly, I'm going to touch on the barriers of supports and services to frame the upcoming conversation of what we can do as a community to really ensure that we are addressing this issue in the best way that we possibly can. So, when we think of barriers to supports and services during a disaster, um, most services and nonprofits are typically underfunded and understaffed already. This is going to worsen, obviously, when there's a disaster. Basic resources for safety and healing become very hard. You also have to consider that those um, workers are also experiencing potentially the same crisis situation. And so they might not necessarily have the ability or the capacity to serve the community that they serve as they normally would had the disaster not occurred. Um, Abusive individuals also have persuaded victims that services are just unavailable or inoperable. And this is to convince the victim that there's no help, even if there potentially is help. Survivors of sexual violence may be exposing themselves to dangerous situations. This is something that I hadn't necessarily thought of until I was doing this research. But one woman had reported that she wanted to go get a rape kit examination, but it was during a flood situation. And so it was very dangerous for her to try to go out and try to access this critical health service of not only a rape kit examination, but also, you know, basic healthcare after an assault happens. And so trying to access these critical health services might not be possible and actually could be far more dangerous for that person to go seek. Virtual services have been shown for the vast majority to be a lifeline for survivors of disaster. But it is very important to consider that there could be a loss of power, loss of internet following a disaster. And so if you think about how many times you are dependent on your phone for resources and, "Oh, I can just Google that or look it up." Well, if the power's been out and somebody doesn't have access to a charger, then they're not able to look up those resources. Or if the internet is completely out and they have no ability to research, or get access to a hotspot, this can further exacerbate their ability to go and get help. And obviously, this is very, difficult when the abuser is living within the household because there is no privacy oftentimes, and the abuser is often very much hovering and trying to be very close and available. One study, specifically within the COVID-19 pandemic, RAIN actually reported a drastic spike in children calling after they were able to get away from their home situation because their abuser, who they were being abused by, the family member, was within the household and they were not able to access at that time. When we think of lack of accessibility, many victims are services are inaccessible to people with disabilities. So you think of setting up an evacuation center or just a temporary housing facility in a crisis to help. Some of those might not necessarily, unfortunately, be available to those with disabilities. And so that's something to very much keep in mind. Additionally, language gaps for those who might not speak English. This is very important for them to receive vital support. So, if there is not access to this information in a way that they can understand, they are not provided the same opportunities and they are not going to get the help that they need. Also, transportation disruptions. Those who depend on public transportation are impacted often the most. They're not able to access services or they're not able to get to these evacuation centers because they don't have transportation and public transportation is not available and running. Essential survivor services, so we think of mental health and reproductive care, those are often deemed non-essential in disaster responses. Courts also have postponed hearings, including protective orders. You think of child and adult protective services who might be doing home visits, might have to suspend those home visits, and so the children and or elderly are not getting checked in on as they should be. Um, there's obviously severe understaffing, long wait lists within these disaster situations, and then hospitals can cancel these what they consider to be non-emergency appointments, and law enforcement prioritizing those disasters. And then lastly, the lack of coordinated and community response and infrastructure. So you think of communication outage, again, those limited hours. Um, service providers facing their own personal and community impacts themselves, and then really struggling to find any volunteers during this time following a disaster, despite the growing need for those services. And so these were some quotes that I found that I really liked. In the chaos, law enforcement is stretched thin, shelters are overcrowded, and basic protections vanish. Sexual violence spikes in these conditions, not because it is inevitable, but because systems aren't designed to prevent it. We must understand sexual violence not just as an interpersonal harm, but as a structural failure. Marginalized communities, I just felt like it was important to include these two slides to really highlight the impact um, on our BIPOC communities that we might be serving. Unfortunately, in research and historically, BIPOC communities do face this disproportionate disaster to risks. For example, race is the strongest predictor of proximity to toxic facilities within the United States. Um, BIPOC neighborhoods are often located in ecologically vulnerable areas, so it increases the exposure to hurricanes and flooding. So, for example, Black homeowners in New Orleans were 3 times more likely to be flooded during Hurricane Katrina due to the geographic and infrastructural neglect. BIPOC voices are continuously excluded from environmental policy and disaster planning, despite them bearing the greatest burdens. And because I felt like it was important to include as well, um, research after Hurricane Harvey actually found that Black and Latinx residents in Texas were less likely to have homeowners, renters, or flood insurance. So this increases um, the harm and slows the ability for these communities to really recover. So in 2019, there were residents at the Pine Ridge Reservation that struggled to get federal aid after what was called a bomb cyclone. It's basically an intense blizzard followed by severe flooding. It displaced approximately 1,500 members of this tribe and stranded many without food or water. But meanwhile, the White House quickly approved national disaster declarations for Nebraska and Iowa that were both affected by the same storm. In a 2020 report, FEMA acknowledged this long and ongoing history of governmental disaster aid benefiting wealthy white homeowners while further entrenching poverty among low income. The report asserts, quote, through the entire disaster cycle, communities that have been underserved stay underserved and thereby suffered needlessly and unjustly. And so with all of this information, um, climate policy continues and our responses and community resources continue to ignore this link. And so hopefully after I go over these next few slides, discussing 1, emergency preparedness, 2, legal reform, and 3, cross collaboration, we'll be able to really equip ourselves to at least begin the conversation and start to be able to address this within our communities. So for emergency preparedness, things that can be done and should be considered. Um, First, I think it's important to highlight that there needs to be a shift in how people are addressing this issue of sexual violence protocols in these emergency situations. It must be handled in a holistic manner. So, yes, basic needs are very important, but just as important is safety, and just as important is mental and physical health. So, treating all three as a priority instead of cherry picking one or the other is going to be essential in really ensuring that we are prepared for these emergency responses in our communities. And um, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and all the leading experts acknowledge and accept that the service delivery and the method that you're delivering services, it's okay to shift that. But what is not okay to shift or change is the core survivor center principles of the organization. And so always remaining true to those core principles despite having to potentially serve the survivor in a method or mean that you might not necessarily in other conditions. So for financial support, specifically things that your organization or you yourself can consider, um, we all saw the donation hubs that are very common to distribute supplies. This is great. We saw this within the Central Texas flooding. But other things that can be done other than just creating this donation hub to give back to the community is thinking of things such as smartphones. Can you provide chargers, hotspots for those that might need online access, or even just the ability to have a location in which somebody can access a hotspot is very important. Another thing that I have not personally seen in an organization that I think would be really beneficial to have, and was mentioned throughout my research, was having information pamphlets on relief funds, unemployment benefits, and other services that are available to the survivor. We think of all of the pamphlets that we might have within our organizations of all the different resources, but do you have one that's specific to addressing relief funds and unemployment benefits in these crisis situations? Um, if after the disaster, there are applications that need to be done, can you designate some of your workers to helping the survivor navigate unemployment applications or relief fund applications and making that part of your protocol in the emergency preparedness realm? I know a lot of people don't have this ability, but if it is something that can be addressed, direct cash assistance programs are considered really great. Being able to get a survivor cash assistance in these disaster situations does alleviate a lot of concerns. Or if that's not a possibility, but you might have funders, can you talk to those funders about having flexible options um, within their funding uh, protocols to allow for housing or material needs in an emergency? And this is a conversation that really should be happening before the disaster hits. You don't want to be waiting until after to go back to a funder and ask for needs, because some things might take longer than others, and or it could just be a no. And so having the ability to have that already lined up and an agreement made that that will be the situation if an emergency does hit. In the realm of housing support for emergency preparedness, um, the three bullet points that are listed are really for after, um, and things that can be in your protocols in the sense of after the disaster hits. So, for example, advocating with landlords, having somebody or a resource that you know that will be willing to work on eviction notices or negotiating rent on behalf of a survivor that you can just call in these emergency situations that specialize in this area, and kind of cross collaborate in that realm. Again, only if possible, but funding extended stay hotels placements instead of sending them to these emergency shelters, especially for families and those that are in the vulnerable communities. Um, that will alleviate a lot of the dangers that they might be facing. And then providing transportation to shelters when other options are not available. So, for example, if public transit is not running, are there things that you can do safely, obviously, to get a survivor to an appointment or get a survivor to any kind of basic service that they might need? For the NSVRC, they mentioned the ability to being willing and prepared for your services to be provided wherever the survivor may be. So that's hotels, shelters, other housing programs. If they're able to make it to one location safely, is there a way that you can meet them there safely as well, to provide the services on site for them? To combat the social isolation that we talked about earlier, proactively reaching out to a survivor, again, keeping in mind safety concerns. We do not want to be reaching out to somebody who might be within the house of their abuser, and announcing who you are, etc. But there are ways, and I know that you all are trained in how to do this in a safe manner. But especially if the person is not within the house of their abuser, too, reaching out to them and ensuring they feel connected or less isolated. Can you help them identify people that they can reach out to for connection and support? So this is really great if you're able to find somebody that's not in the disaster-stricken area. And this is just for capacity purposes, right? You don't want to also be sending them to someone who is just as overwhelmed or in just as a precarious situation that cannot really be there to support the survivor as much as they should be. And then obviously best practices are always warm referrals. This is important too for survivors relocating out of the area. There were some reports, specifically within Katrina, where survivors were relocating out of the area and were just given kind of these blanket referrals, and unfortunately were not able to get the services that they needed because there was no connection made from that warm referral that would be beneficial. And safety planning. I think that this is something that we all can do to be within our emergency preparedness. So, in domestic violence situations and other stalking situations, we all have safety planning protocols, right? And so, how can we make a safety planning protocol available and ready for a natural disaster? So, things that that safety planning can mimic a lot of what your safety plans might already look like, but with a few caveats. So obviously identifying those safe people to connect to, but also can you create a code word or a signal for those trusted individuals that you might be in a shelter and you need help and the abuser is standing right next to you? Is there a code word that you can say that would indicate to those trusted contacts that you're in need of help but can't necessarily say why? Um, in addition to that list of putting together relief funds and other things available, do you have a list of contact information for shelters in multiple formats and languages, and crisis centers, legal aid, victim services? Some of you might already have that, but ensuring that those are up to date, and especially if there is any caveat or any closing after a disaster, making sure that that survivor knows that that resource is not available at that time. Identifying safe shelter options, and this kind of goes back to, can you, and again, this is capacity wise, but is there a way that you can ensure that any shelter that you might be sending a survivor to has some basic safety protocols, considering, are they identifying registered sex offenders? Are there ways in which there are potentially safer sleeping areas for families, etc.? And then you also want to consider having within that safety plan transportation modes that are going to be different in different scenarios. So just because someone says, "Oh, I have a car, I don't need to plan for transportation," you've got to think, okay, well, what if that car is not accessible? What if you depend on public transportation and it's just not available? So having backup plans and different people that they might be able to call as well if they are in that situation. Reminding the survivor, or including within that safety plan to keep a charged phone, a backup battery, and a charger just within consideration of the need for a hotspot as well. I think this would be really great if community members also did this. Is, we've done essential bags and things with basic hygiene products. Can we make that where we put relief fund pamphlets and safety planning information within those essential bags that might include some grounding tools like a journal, or a list of virtual crisis counselors that are not necessarily within that community that can be accessed in the situation where a disaster may hit and those counselors within the area might not be accessible. Um, and then obviously discussing with the survivor what are safety strategies in a shelter. If you have to go to a shelter, what does a secure area look like? What are warning signs that you need to be careful of? Are there exit strategies? Are there ways in which you can keep your children more safe? And always ensuring that somebody is there to make sure that there's no abuse going on within that shelter to the best of their ability. If you happen to be somebody who's running a safe shelter or can provide a safe temporary shelter, um, there are some things that the UN and other leading organizations have really emphasized as important to consider. And that's obviously providing those private spaces. Um, but can you create and distribute to all first responders, shelter staff, two short protocols? So, one one pager, doesn't have to be a whole pamphlet. But the idea is that in these situations, there is a protocol on how to prevent sexual violence in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, and then having another on how to respond to a report for sexual violence. And so having those two flyers already ready, and then when your staff is in that situation, being able to distribute protocol that's already created, is essential to ensuring that people are on the right path, and you're not starting from scratch and trying to coordinate within the chaos of the situation. Always ensuring that if you have shelter staff, other volunteers, that they've already gone through a background check. Now, this does not mean that after the disaster, you start running background checks necessarily, but having those people that have already been through background checks being the ones that are helping, is going to be very beneficial in ensuring that there's safety within your shelter. Providing mandatory orientation sessions and written resources to educate these populations about sexual assault and safety measures, how to identify if um, there is a situation going on that needs to be addressed, safe places that you can have constant security presence in place, or someone that someone can go talk to report any abuse that they might have been suffering. And then ensuring orientations, trainings, and other written resources are all in appropriate languages and available to people who not just do not just speak English. And then lastly, for shelter best practices, if you're running a shelter, closing off any areas that cannot be made safe. So for example, if there is a basement that has a locked door and it's in a dark stairwell or something, is there a way that you can close that off so that there is no way that somebody can access that basement with a locked door? Um, are there ways that you can create background checks or implement protocols on how to handle evacuees who are registered sex offenders, and handle that in a different situation instead of housing them with the children or other vulnerable populations? You can also create designated areas for children to play under the supervision of adults, with safe activities, ensuring that those trained sexual assault prevention staff are available for those children, um, and that they are screened, anybody that is going to be supervising the child play area. And then obviously keeping in mind that we want to ensure protections for LGBTQ identifying individuals, and not just always thinking of um, one specific population over another. And so those were some of the best practices for emergency preparedness and things that your organization can do. I want to briefly touch on some legal reforms. So, for those who are in advocacy or their organization might be in a place where they can lobby for changes, these are some great tips that are available that can really strengthen our laws and also provide essential um, resources to you and your communities that might be serving these survivors. So, some policy recommendations that came out of the United Nations, the World Health Organization, as well as NSVRC, expanding the definition of essential services to include sexual and domestic violence agencies and shelters. So, once these organizations are considered an essential service, um, also dedicating funding to ensure that those essential services that now include sexual and domestic violence agencies are fully equipped to operate beyond a disaster. So thinking of living wages for the workers, access to personal protective equipment and other needed supplies, ensuring adequate funding to respond to the increased volume that's going to happen after a disaster. Creating and crafting policy and law that allocates additional funding to culturally specific organizations. So knowing that these populations are most impacted, are there ways that we can fully ensure that they are also getting additional funding on top of anything that might be provided to them already? You also want to consider, is there a way to advocate for protecting funding that's been previously allocated for essential services, as outlined above, but ensure that the existing resources are not diverted elsewhere in the event of a disaster. So we see this a lot where funds have to be quickly diverted to something else. Is there a way that you can protect those funding within the law as it's written to ensure that the essential services that now include the sexual and domestic violence agencies are not lost? Um, because once a crisis hits, it is essential that that funding be available to those who are serving the communities. And something else that has come up is that there are issues when we are implementing curfews, travel restrictions, and shelters in place during disasters. So, is there a way that we can lobby for and ensure within the law that there are explicit exemptions for those who are trying to flee a situation? So, the survivor should not be harassed, punished, fined, or at further risk for violating any laws when they're trying to escape that abusive situation or access essential services such as the sexual and domestic violence agencies. Within the law, also ensuring that those who are able to access essential services, it should be regardless of their immigration status, and that explicitly states that seeking services will in no way lead to detention, deportation, or involvement with immigration authorities. Um, Further, investing in equitable access to technology. So we think of, are there technology subsidy programs that we can put in place and to advocate for to include wireless internet hotspots, funding for community-based organizations to distribute mobile devices. So is this something that you and your organization would be willing to lobby and advocate for to ensure that in this crisis situation, these mobile devices will be available for survivors who might not have it? Continuing on with the policy recommendations that could be advocated for is providing support and guidance um, and funding opportunities for local and state systems to integrate trauma-informed practices across all sectors, um, specifically in early childhood education, law enforcement, immigration courts, corrections, also incorporating requirements for sector-specific training on trauma-informed practices into funding announcements and contracts with community service providers. And designate or create, so this made me think a lot of our local SARTs, or sexual assault response teams, how they are mandated within the law. Um, is there a way that we can designate or create these local or state collaborative efforts to support implementing trauma-informed approaches through training and technical assistance for sexual violence after a disaster? And so that concluded the legal reforms. And so my last section of recommendations is cross-sector collaboration. And I think this is really where the most impact can be done within the shortest amount of time. If you think of um, you know, legal reform, those things, unfortunately, the Texas legislature only meets every other year. And in addition, as you can imagine, legislative advocacy is not always very simple, and it's very certainly not fast. And so, what are some things that we can do as a community to really ensure that we are addressing these issues without having to wait a significant amount of time? Um, and there was this quote that I found within the research that I also really liked. The problem of violence is deeply interconnected with a wide range of social conditions. Our solutions need to be as comprehensive and interconnected as the problems they seek to address. The challenge is to recognize natural allies whose work has an impact on violence prevention, but whose motivation or interest may not be specifically about violence prevention. And so when we're thinking of how can we create this cross-sector collaboration to address sexual violence and disasters. And so I listed some key community partners that are recommended by the leading advocates in this area and researchers. And it might be things that you've thought of. For example, we've got our rape crisis centers, our domestic violence agencies, which are very important. But can we also consider HIV/AIDS community organizations, workforce development programs, talking to emergency responders and disaster managers, city planners, public workers, food banks, um, businesses, labor unions, local and state public health departments, to really get everybody at the table to talk about this issue and how we can be prepared as a community to address it in the event of a tragedy. And so, what would this organization or this group do? And so, I wanted to put just a few bullet points that I think would be great uses of this cross-sector collaboration that are also very attainable. And so, most importantly, is identifying the strengths and gaps. So, talking about what assets and needs and challenges do each of the organizations and the key stakeholders at the table have, and what could you potentially be partnering with someone else? So although you might not be able to provide X thing, um, and there's another person who's at the table who is able to provide it, and so working very closely with them. The ability to gather community stories, and so we think of innovative services, things, mutual aid efforts, which I'll talk about in a minute, and needs from past disasters that were not met. So, where were the fallbacks that happened, and how can we ensure that we are preparing for that appropriately? So, using those findings to inform your coalition priorities. So, once we have all of the players' assets, and we have all of the successful stories and unsuccessful, unmet needs from past disasters, um, coming together to create this strategic plan to ensure resource allocation is correct. But in addition, also facilitating cross training. So think of providing formal and informal training for disaster responders and service providers and community members, those who might potentially be in this area and working and interacting with survivors of sexual violence in a crisis, but might not necessarily be attuned to not only the issue, but how it can be addressed. Promoting a shared understanding. So, um, that's building awareness of those trauma-informed approaches with everybody at the table to ensure that everyone's on the same page, but also identifying those risk factors we talked about earlier in these disaster contexts so that we know and are all aware of the dangers that exist and how we might be able to prevent them. And equipping stakeholders with tools to respond effectively and compassionately. And so within the emergency preparedness, where I talked about having that list of um, relief funds or services that are available, in addition to a safety plan in those bags, can we equip those stakeholders with those same tools so that they're able to provide those just in case the survivor is able to make it to that one person and maybe not someone else? And so it's all about sharing information and promoting one another in the process. And so we think of facilitating connection and support. Um, that's just sharing information, answering questions, connecting with comprehensive services, being able to build this inclusive service network. Um, you might not necessarily have somebody at your organization that speaks a certain language, but this other culturally specific organization not only speaks the language, but they additionally have the knowledge of cultural norms that would be very beneficial to partner with. Um, Also creating and distributing those directories, so ensuring those updates reflect changes during the disaster. And so I think this is a really great place to even start is these informational sheets and these contact lists that can be easily shared throughout um, these different agencies and organizations. After having this continuity of strategies, so strengthening coordination to avoid duplication and gaps. Um, all about sharing information and identifying where something might be unnecessarily duplicative and confusing for a survivor who might not necessarily understand what the difference is between the two organizations or several. And then, is there a way to ensure resource allocation? So services to the greatest area of need, direct funding, staffing. Is there a way that somebody can jump in from one organization to assist another to kind of alleviate some of the burden on another key stakeholder? And then I amplifying key messages together. So I think this is wonderful. If we are able to have prepared ahead of time, um, two separate messages, one that talks about support is available and the other on how to help. And so the idea is that you have these very quick flyers or graphics, if you will, and having these key community stakeholders be able to share it on their diverse channels. So sharing it on their social media or newsletter once a disaster hits. And because you've already prepared it, it's also available in different languages that can be shared very quickly and reshared. So people that you might not necessarily have access to are still getting the same message. And so the support available message would be promoting help seeking, healthy coping, and legal protections. So, for example, addressing things such as housing, employment, and immigration in these crisis situations. Um, the other message would be how to help. So, encouraging bystander intervention and community vigilance. Are there graphics and flyers that you can create in preparation for these emergency situations that include examples of exploitative behavior, strategies to interrupt it safely, but also safety within an emergency shelter, what that looks like, and how you can identify warning signs in these easy shareable graphs and flyers that can be shared on all different kinds of platforms throughout. And then, of course, collaborating with partners for accurate, culturally and inclusive messaging. This is very important to not get siloed and think that one organization has the solution for this issue. Um, it's just unrealistic. And so the work to eliminate inequity and injustice is an integral part of both disaster preparedness and violence prevention. And everybody has a role to play. So, as we talked about, community members sharing resources and social support, building those coalitions, advocating for equitable policies and programs. Service providers, you can build accessible, equitable, and holistic systems of care. Policymakers, prioritizing equity in housing, healthcare, disaster management, and everything that we've talked about within the legal reform. And all of these strategies to meaningfully prevent and respond to sexual violence can increase safety and healing. And I think that that's something that continuously came up in my research is that so many people think in a disaster situation that it's just inevitable, and it doesn't have to be. There are things that we can do, and unfortunately, we've been very behind the ball on addressing prevention of sexual assault in these disaster situations. And I know that this question comes up quite a bit for resources and funding. And so there are federal funding resources. However, I also understand and know that that is not always the best route or not the route that your organization might not, that you just might not want to take it, or it just might not be available for specific reasons. And so thinking of community-based funding strategies that are not dependent on federal funding. There is the Sexual Assault Prevention and Crisis Services grant here in Texas, and that can be used for training, technical assistance, and service coordinations. So can you leverage that to kind of help with this emergency preparedness and ensure that this issue is being addressed properly? Another idea is to engage local foundations and philanthropic networks. So think a little bit outside of the box on this one. When you're looking for funding to potentially prepare, are there climate justice experts or networks that you can tap into that they might not necessarily specify that they work in sexual violence or prevention, but they are very passionate about climate justice. And so working with them to be able to collect and collaborate on funding options. Um, Other organizations or foundations that focus on gender equity, of course, but also disaster recovery. So not just thinking about um, typical players that you might depend on, but thinking a little more in the lines of climate and disaster-based networks. And then lastly, using mutual aid and participatory budget models. So, for example, mutual aid projects, looking into it, it's very much, I think one article described it as not wanting to be dependent on the state or the government for assistance. And so, with that lens of focusing on what can we do that might not be government based, mutual aid projects have developed, and it's this collaboration of just um, community organizations coming together to donate products that are needed, to really kind of lend a hand to one another. What allocation of resources do you have? What do we have? What can we share that we might have more of that you might be in need of, basically. And so, two great examples of this working was in Hurricane Katrina. They founded a mutual aid organization called the Common Ground Relief, and it provided immediate needs like housing, health, and clothing. And it emphasized working together to rebuild lives in sustainable ways. And this was separate and apart from and completely just their community coming together to put this together. In addition, after Superstorm Sandy, thousands of people came together to create Occupy Sandy, and they provided water, food, and other resources and support that were otherwise unavailable to many of the residents affected. And so, again, it's this, are there donation hubs that we can create? Can we share our resources together? Can we pull together to really create this mutual aid that we're not necessarily dependent on a grant to help us? Or even, funders that might have specific specifications. And so, although there were, there's not necessarily been, to my knowledge, any data or outpouring of sexual violence after the Texas flooding. I did think it was just interesting to highlight some of what the special session did to address climate change specifically, not sexual violence and climate change, but climate change after the Texas flooding. So, for example, some of the things that passed was a grant program that covers the cost of sirens to maintain and operate warning sirens. And so, you all know this probably far better than I, but there were concerns of people not necessarily getting the message fast enough and unfortunately not being able to leave the situation. And so that's what's really driven a lot of the policy we saw come out of the special session. I think there was a lot of missed opportunities in the sense of really expanding these to not be as specific. But I also think that it's wonderful that these um, uh, improvements have been made because they are necessary. Um, so other legislation was passed that banned building of new cabins in floodplains. This is again for those camps that were unfortunately in those floodplains. Um, they are required to notify, camps are required to notify parents of any existing cabins that are located in floodplains and required to sign a form acknowledging that they have been notified that that camp is in a floodplain. Um, Camps are required to have several disaster alert tools on site. So think of radios, emergency public address systems. There's also a 28 million grant that was approved to be used for what they called enhanced atmospheric measurement. And it was basically to improve the accuracy of state weather forecasting because that was believed to be a contributor was that there was not accurate forecasting after this. And then lastly, there was a disaster scam response bill. There were people who were impacted by the flood who were receiving scam calls. There were also people who were being tricked into donating a significant amount of money, and unfortunately, it was not a valid organization that would be helping in this disaster relief. And so what this bill does is it creates a voluntary accreditation program for nonprofits to raise money for disaster relief. And it also creates criminal penalties associated with any malicious solicitation and impersonating a disaster volunteer with the intent of stealing. So again, it doesn't necessarily address what we've talked about today with regards to the link between climate change and sexual violence, but I do think that there's a lot of room in which these could be expanded upon, and we can continue to advocate legislatively to better address this within Texas. And finally, I just wanted to list some other resources if you are like me and this topic is fascinating and you'd like to learn more. NSVRC provides a disaster planning guide, and it kind of walks you through some planning options and what you can do. In addition, for thinking of funding, if there's a situation in which you're not able to do mutual aid efforts, the grants are not possible, and you're not able to get these funders from other philanthropic organizations. The NSVRC did create a relief fund for relocation and rebuilding. They do have specific requirements. So the relief fund is to support the need for sexual assault survivors and advocacy program staff. It aids with expanding direct service needs, assists with prevention initiatives to protect evacuees from sexual violence. Um, there is a brief application that you have to fill out, but I also included their email address if you just wanted to talk. I also know that their website takes donations as well to contribute to this disaster relief fund. Um, and so with that, I think we've got a few minutes to spare, but there's my LinkedIn if anybody wants to nerd out about this further. If you have any questions, if something comes up and you really want to talk something over or you're curious as to an article, just shoot me a message on LinkedIn and I'm more than happy to talk about it and discuss it.
All right. I have to get loaded on the camera before I start talking to y'all. So I actually spent my last year of my master's programming studying this topic. So I happen to have, as soon as Samantha started referencing that NSVRC planning guide, I was like, I have that document right there, right there. So I did pop that in the chat for y'all. That's a really, really great resource. And one of the things I love about our TASA webinars is when participants walk away with the aha, I've never thought about it like that moment. And I know when I was introduced to this topic in graduate school, and I had 25 years of victim services experience, and I was like, I've never thought of it that way. So yeah, this is a really important topic, and not to charge y'all with more work, but we're always giving y'all more work to do. If you are not involved with your local disaster preparedness meetings, meeting those contacts, just getting to know them, like, where are they at? Where's their office? Like, this was such brand new territory to every advocate I've ever had a conversation about this topic with. They're like, I just did not know that this might be something we need to be taking care of. And like any other situation, like when we talk about our hospital accompaniment and stuff like that, we don't want to be doing our planning at 2 o'clock in the morning. But that happens to be when climate disasters always tend to occur. They don't send you an email 2 months in advance and say, oh, by the way, I'll be coming to visit on this day at this time. So it's just stuff we don't think about. So super interesting content. Another area, if y'all would like to ever do a part two on this, is that incidents of domestic and sexual violence increase in first responders, in the homes of first responders, right around a year after they have actually worked and responded with these. So there's a whole second population out there that victim advocates are also learning more about and learning how to work with and reach out to, because it does happen as a result, and there's a connection to the vicarious trauma and the helplessness that so many first responders feel trying to protect their families, trying to protect their communities. And then with so many climate disasters, there's just stuff we cannot do, right? San Angelo was one of the the communities that was affected by the floods during the 4th of July. And I was away at TASA conference and trying to travel back to my children and to my family. And that was just a drive. And I was perfectly safe to do that. I was a little bit delayed. It was a minor inconvenience compared to what other community members were experiencing. And I still carry that with me. So I can't imagine what other kinds of stress our first responders are having to go through. And, it makes sense that violence would somehow creep back in and be connected to that as well. So, does anybody else have any questions for our speaker or anything like that? So, yes, I see a question in the chat box about reaching out to other counties, cities, states, yeah, and just being really, really aware and making those connections. So we're always talking about connections and the need to make them, and then we introduce a whole new group that you got to learn and take to lunch or have coffee with and just get to know how they operate and what they do. So, all right, y'all. I have posted the evaluation link. We have the training certificates ready to go. Like I said, we will be distributing those as a group for people that have been attending all of our series. I'm so sad we're getting close to the end. Next week is the last one. So our SAB members have contributed so much great knowledge to this series. So it's great that we're going to end it and you get a little bit of your time back on Friday mornings, but also they have been so powerful in all the information they've put together. So I truly hope y'all have enjoyed it. Thanks for those of y'all that have been here week after week after week. And we will see y'all next Friday for our last session. Okay.